Hi there everyone and welcome to another episode of the Uncast Show. So I want to wish you a good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you're watching this from in the world. Now today's video is the official Uncast video about Unraid 7. So this video is going to be absolutely great. Now in this video we're going to be talking not only about all of the new features, we're going to be talking about things such as Unraid subpools, or auxiliary VDEVs. And as we'll be setting up a server from scratch, of course, we're going to be talking about Z-pools. Now, have you ever wondered what's the difference when you've got 4 drives? If you put that into a RAID Z2, so you have 2 drives of redundancy, or you chose to have 2 sets of 2 mirrored drives? Well, you're going to have the same amount of redundancy, but is there any difference? Okay, so in my opinion, one of the biggest things in Unraid 7 is the fact that we don't actually need to have an Unraid array anymore. If we go across to my server here, Battlestar, we can see an example of this. Now this server has only 2 Z-pools, both of which are SSDs. This top one here has a usable space of about 10 terabytes and it consists of 2 terabyte SATA SSDs. Now this faster pool beneath here, this is made up of 3 4 terabyte NVMe drives. And as you can see here, there is no Unraid array. Oh, and there's a third pool here I forgot about, which I call Z-Rust, basically because this drive here is a 12 terabyte regular hard drive, hence I call this one Z-Rust, as in ZFS Rust pool. Okay, so one thing I want to mention about NVMEs and SSDs in general is it's highly recommended not to actually use them in a regular Unraid array. And the reason for that is because inside of the Unraid array, trim or discard as it's called is not actually supported on SSDs. So if we use SSDs in our server, we should always use them in a pool. Now, before we actually go ahead and look at how we can have our Unraid server without an array, I just want to say that I really do love the Unraid array. If we go to my main server here, BaseStar, we can see here that I still have an Unraid array. I think the Unraid array is absolutely excellent. I think the Unraid array is unbeatable for media duties, for storing your media for things like Plex, Jellyfin or Emby. You can't actually beat the Unraid array because whenever you need more space, you can just add another drive really easily without any problem at all. And my favorite file system for the Unraid array, as I said earlier, is XFS. But you'll notice that I do actually have a ZFS drive in my Unraid array. And the reason I have one drive as ZFS is because I like to actually have some of the other Z-pools in this server be able to replicate ZFS data into the array onto this particular drive. But we're not going to talk about ZFS replication today. We can have a look at that in another video sometime in the future. Now, let's go back to the server that we were on at the beginning of this video. Now we can see here, we've just got this small array of 3 drives, 1 parity and 2 data. So if we wanted to actually get rid of this array, now maybe I decide that I don't want to actually have an Unraid array anymore. I still want to use these drives, but I want to use them in a pool. Now, obviously, one thing to note, if you ever change your Unraid array and you want to make it as a pool, you're going to have to move the data from your Unraid array to somewhere else. And we can't actually do it in the same way as what we did a moment ago using Mover. We'd have to actually manually move all of the data somewhere else first if we wanted to convert our Unraid array into a pool. Okay, so I don't have any data on this array that I actually care about. So I'm going to stop the array here. And what we need to do is unassign all of these drives. And then with all of the drives unassigned, we go to slots here and we set the slots to none. So here we can see now there's currently no Unraid array. Okay, so now with these drives removed from the array, I can now set them if I want to be in their own pool. Now if I scroll down here, we can see here I've got 5 drives that I can choose from. There are 4 4 terabyte drives here, which are spinning Rust drives. They're regular hard drives. And also I've got a 1 terabyte SSD. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new pool. So I'm going to click on Add Pool here, and I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it Rusty. And for slots, because I've got 4 4 terabyte drives, I think I'm going to choose 4. And I'm going to click on to Add. Okay, so now we can see here that another pool is being created. So now I just need to select the disks of which I want to have this pool made from. So here I've selected all of my 4 terabyte drives. Now, one thing I like to do before I actually start is I come along and I click onto the pool here. And before I do anything, I always click Erase Pool. And to do that, I just need to confirm the name of the pool. So I'm going to type in Rusty. And now that's erased the pool, getting rid of any data that I might have had on those drives. For pools made up of multiple disks, we've got the choice of either ZFS or ButterFS. Now, if we were only to have one drive in the pool, we would also have the choice of XFS. But for multiple drives, it's either ZFS, ButterFS, or the encrypted Lux versions of those file systems. Now, in my opinion, ZFS wins hands down. Although there are use cases for ButterFS, I do prefer ZFS. If we're using a RAID 5 or equivalent, well, ButterFS isn't the best for that. RAID 5 in ButterFS, in fact, is still not officially marked as stable. So I'm going to use ZFS here, and now I get the choice of how I want to use these disks in my Z pool. So what I've got here, I've got the choice of Stripe, Mirror, RAID Z1, RAID Z2, and RAID Z3. So a Stripe, what's that? Well, if I was to use a Stripe, this would put all of my 4 disks together and stripe all the data across it, but there would be no redundancy at all. This would give me the best speed, but it would be quite a risky thing to do. So the next thing here is a mirror. So with a mirror, that's exactly what it sounds like. It mirrors the data on different drives. So here I can have 2 VDEVs of 2 devices. So that's basically 2 groups of 2 drives that would be mirrored. Or I can have 1 VDEV of 4 drives. So that would just give me 4 copies of the data, each drive being a copy of the other. Now, obviously, when you're using mirrors, we are losing a significant amount of space. So, in my opinion, using RAID Z is a good compromise between the both. So, what are RAID Z levels? Now, if you're familiar with regular RAID levels, RAID 5 is basically what RAID Z1 is. Now, the properties of RAID Z1 mean we stripe the data across all 4 drives, but we lose the space of 1 drive in the parity calculations that are actually written to these drives. Unlike what we're used to in a regular Unraid array, where 1 drive holds all of the parity, in RAID Z1, the parity information is striped across all of the 4 drives. In fact, this is one reason why Unraid arrays are really easy to actually add disks to, because the parity is kept separately. And in fact, if we look at my Unraid array here, you can see here that I've got 1 drive of parity making up my pool. And so basically a 1-disk parity array is very similar to RAID Z1, because we lose 1 disk in size of available space in the actual pool or the array due to parity. Using RAID Z1, I would have 3 of the 4 terabyte drives available for data, so I'd have a usable space of 12 terabyte. Now, if I wanted to be a bit more cautious, I could choose RAID Z2, and this would give me 2 drives out of the 4 that would be used for parity. But because I've only got 4 drives that make up the pool, I would be losing 50% of usable space. So RAID Z2 would allow me to lose any 2 drives in my pool and still not lose any data. But because I've only got 4 drives in this pool, I would be losing 2 drives worth of space. So it would give me a very similar protection and usable space than if I chose a mirror and had 2 VDEVs, now a VDEV being a group of drives that were mirrored. So again, I would lose 50% of the space, but I could lose 2 drives and still actually be okay. Now, I want to actually talk about, when we come to choices like this, of what actually is the difference. So if I'm going to lose, say, 50% of the space of these drives, what would be the advantage of having a mirror of 2 groups of 2 devices, or choosing RAID Z2 and having 1 VDEV of 4 devices? Well, if I chose the mirror here, In my opinion, this is actually going to give me slightly better performance having two mirrored VDEVs than if I used RAID Z2. But with RAID Z2, I can lose any two of these drives and not lose data. But with a mirror, with two groups of two devices, let's say we've got Group A and Group B, if I lost one drive from Group A and one drive from Group B, everything's cool. I'm not going to lose any data. But if the two drives that failed were both from Group A, well, I'm going to lose the whole pool and I'll lose all of my data. So, if I want to actually be super safe, I would use RAID Z2. So any two drives can actually fail, and it doesn't matter which two that do fail, because I've only got one group of four devices. But if I wanted to go for a little bit more performance, I would probably use the mirror and the two groups of two devices. Okay, so let's move on and think about RAID Z3. Now, again, this just wouldn't be used really if you've only got four drives in your pool. It's really pointless. But what this allows us to do is have any three drives fail and we don't lose any data. Now, if I had, say, 12 drives in this pool, RAID Z3 might be a good fit. But for my little 4x4 terabyte pool I've got here, RAID Z1 is going to give me the best bang for buck. I can lose any one drive in the pool. My performance is going to be pretty good. So that's what I'm going to choose. Now you can see here that I've got compression turned on. Now, a lot of people worry about turning on compression. They think if they turn compression on, well, it's got to actually slow down the server. Well, in fact, in 99% of cases, it's the reverse of that. It's quicker to actually read compressed data and less of it off the drives than it is to read more data that's uncompressed and read that off the drives. Modern CPUs are so fast that it doesn't really touch the sides when decompressing compressed data. So the read and write speeds are just faster from having the compression, and plus we get to fit more data on our drives. So in my opinion, it's a win-win. Okay, so that's how I'm setting up my pool. So with that done, I'm going to click on to apply. And then done. Okay, so now we can see here are my four drives in the pool. Okay, so now let's take a look at here where it says add subpool. Now these are basically auxiliary VDEVs, which Unraid calls subpools. And that's because they're additional devices that can be added to the Z pool to provide specific performance or functionality benefits. So unlike the main pool, these subpools serve specialized purposes that can help improve performance, but only in certain workloads. However, there's one critical thing that we need to remember. If some of these auxiliary VDEVs fail, we can end up losing all of the data on a pool. So that's really something important to keep in mind. And what I like to say is if you're not sure whether you need a subpool, well, you probably actually don't. But anyway, let's go through each type, what they do, and whether, in fact, they might be useful for you. Now, I think for most Unraid Homelabbers, the only two of these really that are worth considering is the slog and the L2 arc. The others, like special metadata and deduplication, in my opinion, they're often more trouble than what they're worth. So first up, we've got the slog, or what that stands for is separate log device. This is for what are called synchronous writes. Now, most everyday writes are actually not synchronous at all. They're actually asynchronous and don't use this. But some applications, such as certain databases or NFS shares, these do actually require sync writes to guarantee the data integrity. So what does this slog actually do? What it does is it gives a fast location for these writes to be committed to before they're written to the main pool. So it basically makes the synchronous writes faster because it's going to like a fast SSD first, and so it can improve reliability and consistency for these type of workloads. Now, what a slog doesn't do, it won't make your gaming VM run faster. It won't speed up your file transfers unless they do rely on synchronous writes. I like to think of a slog a bit like a car spoiler. It looks fancy on kind of like supercars and things like that. And yes, it does provide aerodynamic benefits for those type of cars. But if we just got a little family car and we only drive it at 30 miles an hour, well, we could stick a spoiler on it, and besides looking really cool, and that's debatable, most home users just don't need one. So unless you know your workload relies heavily on sync writes, you don't really need a slog. Okay, next, L2 ARC, or what that stands for is Level 2 Adaptive Replacement Cache. And this acts as a secondary cache for ZFS, which primarily uses the RAM for caching recently accessed files. So when data is frequently read, ZFS tries to keep a copy of the most recent data in either its RAM, or if you have an L2 ARC, when the RAM's maxed out, it can keep it there as well. So what does this do? Well, it speeds up the reads for data we constantly access, but it only does that if our RAM becomes full. If it doesn't, then this won't actually do anything at all. So in my opinion, if you've got a choice between an L2 ARC and adding more RAM to your server, add more RAM to your server. ZFS loves RAM. It's super fast. And also more RAM in your server, it benefits the server all round. Now, one thing I think as well that a lot of people sometimes forget with an L2 ARC device is it must be significantly faster than the actual main pool. Okay, so I think it's time for another analogy. Now, I really do love my analogies. Now, if you like coffee like me, and I've got mine here, imagine you go to work and there's a Starbucks across the street from your office. You go in there and you pick up a cup of coffee and you put it onto your desk. Now, the fastest way to get your caffeine hit is obviously to reach across to your desk, grab the coffee and to take a sip. But what happens when you run out of coffee? Well, you're going to have to walk all the way back to Starbucks and get another cup. So imagine the Starbucks is like the pool, and the cup of coffee on your desk is like the RAM or just a regular ARC cache. Now, an L2 ARC is a bit like you put a coffee machine down the hall a bit in the break room, and so you don't have to go all the way to Starbucks to get a coffee. You can more quickly get one by going to the break room. But if you put that same coffee machine up on, say, the 3rd or 4th floor, then you might have to go all the way up the stairs. It's going to be really tiring, and it'll take you longer than it would do just to pop out the door, pop across the street to Starbucks and grab a coffee. So my roundabout way with this crazy, silly story is basically what I'm trying to say is you always have to make sure with your L2 ARC device that it is actually faster than the actual pool you're pulling the data from. If it isn't, then you're really wasting your time having an L2 ARC, because it would be as fast or faster just to pull the data straight from the pool anyway. Okay, so let's move on to my least favorite auxiliary VDEVs now. I'm going to talk about the special meta VDEV. Now, this auxiliary VDEV can store metadata like file structure and small files on a fast device, basically to improve access time. So what does this drive actually do? Well, it speeds up operations that involve lots of metadata lookups like directories with thousands and thousands of files. Now, there is a big downside. The downside is if this VDEV is lost, like you don't have it mirrored, you only had one, you would actually lose the whole pool. So imagine that you had, say, 10, 20 terabyte drives in your Z pool, and you just had one 1 terabyte NVMe that you used as a special metadata VDEV, and that one NVMe fails, well, you're going to lose the data on the whole of the pool. So unless you've really got a special reason to use a special VDEV, then I would advise not to. And personally, if I was going to use a special VDEV, I would probably have it triple mirrored. You really don't want that to fail because you would lose all of the data on the pool. Okay, I think it's time for another analogy. So imagine a pool without a special metadata VDEV. It's basically like a delivery driver who uses a map. He gets around, he looks up the address, looks on the map, gets his paper map out, has a look, and gets to the destination. So having a special metadata VDEV is a bit like he's got a GPS. So it's great, he can easily get around much quicker than using the map. But as soon as that GPS fails and he doesn't have that anymore, well, he can't actually do any deliveries at all. He knows the addresses, but he's got no maps and he can't see where anything is. So in my opinion, for us Homelabbers, we probably don't really have the use case that we'd need to have a special metadata VDEV. So I think it's probably, in my opinion, best avoided. And the same I'd say with the deduplication VDEVs as well. So how does deduplication work in ZFS? Well, basically we don't actually need to have a dedicated deduplication VDEV in order to use deduplication. It will normally just use RAM, but it does use huge amounts of RAM. I think it's about 5 gigs per terabyte of deduplicated data that we need to have for deduplication to work properly. And so what the deduplication VDEV does is we can add an additional drive to actually store the deduplication tables on that drive when we don't have enough RAM. But for most of us, we probably don't have loads of duplicated data. Now, if we had millions of, say, Windows 10 install ISOs, yes, we'd probably save a lot of space. But for people who use media servers and that kind of thing, I doubt you're going to have hundreds of copies of the same movie and that kind of thing. Now, an analogy for deduplication. Imagine that I hire someone to stay at home and I say, when I go to the shop, I'm going to call you, look in my cupboards and check I don't buy the same groceries. So I give them a call and I say, hey, pasta, do I have pasta? And they say, no, you got no pasta. And I think, well, yeah, that's because I ate it all last week and I wouldn't be going shopping if my cupboard was full of food. So what I'm trying to say here with my analogy is it's costing me more money to pay that person to be at home looking in my cupboards, and my shopping trip's taking me twice as long because I'm having to call them and say, is that food in the cupboard, yes or no? And then they have to tell me. So basically, deduplication as well, if that VDEV actually failed, I would lose access to the data on that pool, just the same as I was talking about with these special VDEVs earlier. So I think for most people, you probably don't need to use a dedupe VDEV. That's just my opinion. Now, the last auxiliary VDEVs I'm going to speak about, they're not fully supported in Unraid yet, but they are coming soon. They're spares, and they are exactly what they sound like. Basically, a spare drive you can add to a pool, so should one of the drives fails, it will automatically use that spare drive, pop it into the pool, resilver the data, and you don't actually have to swap out the drive yourself. So really, really useful in my opinion. But hey, I'm going to show you guys something before I go. I've just got a new hard drive this morning. This is actually the largest one I've ever had, 22 terabytes. And I'm going to be using this in an upcoming Uncast video that should be out very soon, where I'm going to build an extremely low power server. It's going to be sipping electricity in the same way as a politician sips the truth, sparingly, if at all. Anyway, everyone, this brings us to the end of this Uncast show. Now, remember, if you want to watch about Tailscale, then check out the Tailscale episode on the Uncast show. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one.